Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
All right, John, it's your turn. Tell us about your story.
I brought the story The Frog Prince by Robert Coover. We did a story by him a long time ago with Rob when Rob brought it. It was The Babysitter.
Oh, that was his?
That was Robert Coover. That was the same guy, yeah.
Yeah, he is a weird guy.
That's right. This is different than The Babysitter, obviously, but still weird.
Very.
The prince was adorable. All the girls at the bridge club, squirming with envy, said so, though you could still see the effects his previous residence had had on him. He had heavy-lidded eyes and a wide mouth like a hand puppet's. His complexion was a bit off, and his loose-fitting skin was thin and clammy. His semen had a muddy taste, like the pond he came from, and his little apparatus was disappointing. But his tongue was amazing. It could reach the deepest recesses, triggering sensations she'd never known before. His crown was not worn like a hat. It grew out of his head like horns and sometimes got in the way, but his tongue was long enough for detours and tickled other parts on the path in. It gave him not so much a lisp as a consonantal slurp, making gibberish out of his sweet nothings. But talking was never the main thing between them.
Sick.
Maybe I should have read the first paragraph.
Yeah, I think I know why you picked the second.
It sets the scene, right?
Yeah, the frog's he's a horny little guy. So how did you come across this, or had you read it before?
I had not read this before. I was reading a book of interviews with John Gardner, and he kept referencing Robert Coover. Well, he kept calling him Bob Coover. And I was like, hey, isn't that the babysitter guy? I should read more of his stories. So I looked up some stories and read this one and said, hey, let's do that on the podcast.
It's so weird. We talk all the time about how stories like this that are doing something weird, especially when you kind of have to like suspend your disbelief for a little bit, you know. Obviously, this is not real, but it's also not like sci-fi, really. They're not trying to convince you that this is a thing that is happening. You're just supposed to be like along for the ride.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that when you are taking an approach like this, you should probably dip out a little earlier than you planned. You know, you can't like hit on all the notes that maybe you had envisioned before you started, where you're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if...
That's right.
It's like the perfect length for something like this. And with stories that are just trying to do something clever, I guess, or interesting or different. I don't know about you, but for me, if the writing's good enough and the premise is unique enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're kind of like, you're reading along and you're like, ha ha ha, weird. But then the kind of point sneaks up on you.
Yeah.
So it really wasn't until like the very last paragraph, that you realize that maybe there was a point all along, or maybe Bob just inserted this point like at the end because he knew he couldn't really write a Frog Prince story that long. Or maybe this has been like a metaphor the whole time. Whatever it is, it's like a metaphor that's like gone over the edge a little bit, right? Because then we're like snapped back to reality and he's like, yeah, so after she was done kissing the Frog Prince, she got back with her ex. And, and then we're like, oh, right. Okay. So this is not just a trick that the writer's pulling off. There's maybe like a message too. And I was really into it. I like stories like this because they are so short. Like they're also not going to like belabor that point, right? So maybe we could reread this and see that there are hints at that takeaway at the end there. The idea that she gets back with an ex, and I don't want to spoil it. I don't know. I love spoiling it though.
I think the point of our podcast is to spoil it. We assume of the listener that they went and followed the link we provided in the show notes.
Yeah, right, Dad. Yeah, my dad definitely read it. Okay, I'm going to read the last paragraph then. It says, in the end, she got in touch with her ex and told him that she had been hooked on a weird drug, but had kicked it now, and if he'd like to come back, she'd welcome him. He was also lonely, smoking and drinking too much, his own affairs having come to nothing, and so gratefully he returned, and they found a certain contentment, living more or less happily ever after, which is what now is while one's in it. So, you know, the point being that I love this point, happily ever after. Until your characters are dead, you don't know that. So I get really upset in journalism, especially when someone is missing and they'll say something like never heard from again, but we've also never recovered a body. And I'm like, this is inaccurate. You're also predicting the future. You're supposed to say like they haven't been seen since. And so I love that this is like this clever like turn of phrase where it's like happily ever after. Well, they think that now, they feel that way now, but we also know that she felt that way with this frog prince who, from the paragraph you read, we know they don't even like talk to each other. They just do weird tongue shit.
That's right.
So wasn't going to last. And you can kind of predict that. But anyway, so Yeah, I like that it's a short little experimental type story, and that matching that whole tone and brevity is this point at the end where it's like, yeah, you think you're happy while you're happy. You think you're going to be happy forever while you're happy. And then it's done. It just ends. And I don't know that I'll remember the ending of this story when I recall this Frog Prince story, right?
No, you're
But I
gonna
think
think of the
I'm just gonna think of weird tongue shit, right?
yeah.
And I also like there's a scene like a couple paragraphs in where he's like on her back, the way like tree frogs like sit like on the wall of your house or whatever. They're just like,
Yeah.
holding on. Like I loved it.
That so good at painting
Yeah.
that. You see it so clearly.
Yeah, that image, and with images like that, maybe you're familiar with them. And at least like you and I were with like those things are all over Florida, right? These like
Oh, yeah.
Cuban tree frogs are invasive and they feel that way. They're just like gripping on everything that way. And the talent of a writer is to make you see what you already know differently.
Yes.
So that's all great. But yeah, back to my point, I won't remember this ending. But every time if I reread this story, it will be as delightful as it was the first time to realize that there was kind of a little bit of a point, and it is kind of all going back to this fairy tale genre, right? Happily ever after, Frog Prince, whatever.
Yeah, this story played a lot with that. I love he obviously was like, I'm gonna play around with the fairy tale story, the Frog Prince, the Prince Frog, happily ever after, all that kind of stuff. We're going to go into this, and it really works well. I found the ending. I'm not saying that what you're pointing out isn't there. I felt it more emotionally than I did thinking about it as a kind of message or a takeaway. Is like more of her emotional journey to get to that point.
For sure.
Yeah, which this obviously reminded me of the stories like Town of Birds that we did on the podcast, and Donald Barnum, we did the school, the one with the just the weirdness. It's like stories where strange things happen, like in Town of Birds, everyone's turning into a bird, right? Yeah. And I remember when we talked about Town of Birds, I think you had looked it up, that the author said, oh, it doesn't have a meaning. It doesn't mean anything. It's just yeah. Where I think this one is a little more deliberate in reaching like the point, like you pointed out at the end, or having that journey to reach that moment at the end. Town of Birds had that like moment at the end, but it wasn't like we talked about in that episode, it didn't have like a specific metaphorical interpretation that was obvious for it, right? Yeah,
that one was disappointing. I remember because I spent a little more time than normal trying to decipher the message. I was like, I think it's a meth addiction riddling the town. And then I like Google it. I was like, you're kidding. You're kidding. You jerk.
But at the same time, you don't have to read this as a metaphor. You don't have to read this in that way. You can take it all literally, like that she literally had spent this relationship with this frog dude, and then realize at the end that happiness is just, what you have at the moment. And like she doesn't have to chase happiness. She can be content. Yeah.
Well, I think too, there's a really strong emphasis when they're talking about this frog guy on the fact that they're having what sounds like great sex, but she's also high the entire time.
Yes.
Because she's tripping off his literal toad body, which you can do. You can go into the wild, I guess, and lick certain frogs. I wouldn't do it. So I would argue like she probably wasn't happy with this frog guy, but she didn't know it. This is just like she was using him as a balm in a certain way. She probably knew he wasn't enough. So it's like, happiness is temporary, but also she was delusional. And there's that little section too, where she talks about how even the frog is thinking to himself, this is not how I thought it would be, because he misses being a frog.
Yeah. And he asked her in a slurping way if she was happy where she was. Oh, yes, totally, she exclaimed breathlessly. This is like in the middle of her high. She's like enjoying everything that's happening in that moment. And then that's when he leaves. He left her there, went back to the pond to crawl into the mud.
Yeah. He's like, I'd rather just be a regular frog.
Yeah.
I can't really think of anything else I've read that, like, because this is such a common reference from fairy tales, the Frog Prince.
Yeah.
And this is like something that people talk about to this day. Like, you got to kiss a bunch of frogs.
It's a metaphor.
So common. Yeah. Yeah, we hear it all the time. And I really can't think of a time when I've heard a new twist on it, so this is fun that way.
Yeah, one thing you kind of touched on it. You said the phrase, as a writer, you're supposed to make people see things that they're familiar with. I don't remember if you said in a new way, but I think the key to that is like when you read it described that way, you said, "Oh yeah, that's exactly how it is." And I always
Yeah,
knew that, but it
exactly.
was never
Yeah.
pointed out to me. So you're not like learning something; you're just learning to appreciate what you've already seen in a
Yeah.
cool way.
Like this is one of the first lessons I learned in writing, like in high school, because I remember reading books and I would underline phrases, and I was underlining them because they all rang true to me, and I just didn't know that other people were articulating things that I had thought. Not to compare myself to the likes of the Bronte sisters, but when I read Jane Eyre, I was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And obviously I'm not the first person to have like thought some of this stuff, but when you read it and you feel as if like you recognize some truth, or somebody has like articulated something that, like you said, you know this, but now you're seeing it and you just maybe haven't even talked to another person about it that way. It's like when you're watching a movie and you're like, this reminds me of such and somebody's like, yes, and you just feel like in that moment like totally understood. So yeah, you're right, he's describing something that we all know. We're not necessarily learning something new, but like it's like the joy of like recognizing it and seeing it similarly. And you've never described his little frog fingers that way, but now that Robert Coover has, you're like, yep, I know, they're weird little suction cups.
It isn't, I mean, we've never seen a frog turn into a person, and he's describing it as it's an incomplete metamorphosis. He looks weird. He acts weird. So he's like still froggy as a person. He's got loose skin, his eyes bulge and
Yeah.
a little crown and stuff. But the way he's describing all this is like you see the frogginess. It makes you see frogs very clearly. And so, but even though you're seeing it on this like human frame that's kind of just like draped over, the fact that he can do that with something that is entirely new and yet still
Yes.
feel familiar to us. I think that is like that's like a goal. That's a goal as a writer, is like to create something brand new that nobody has ever thought of and yet make it feel as if when people read it, they're like, this is the absolute truth about this thing. And I should have always known.
Right. And that, or like I said, when I'm reading like Jane Eyre, thinking to myself, dude, she gets me. She gets me. Like you're not even like reading this Coover story and going like, wow, what a brilliant genius. You're like, yeah, he gets it. He's a frog guy too. Like we're the same. There's like a camaraderie, because you think that the two of you are the one like in this commune for this moment in time where you're like, yep, he gets it. I get it. This is fire. This is good content. And really, like you said, there's probably tons of people that have thought this. It's just like the writer's power is in articulating it.
Yeah, that's like the hardest thing to talk about in the workshop is you read a story, it's like, it's good, it's fine, but I don't necessarily think you haven't expressed like that like you're not really showing us the scene, the characters, the situation in that kind of writerly way,
Right.
It's really hard to figure out exactly how to give the feedback of look again,
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, you can edit this out, but I remember like always talking about like, I really pride myself on finding the right word. And I'm like, it's more than that. It's more than the right adjective. It's like, have you actually seen it in a different way? It'd be different if like Coover were like looking at the ocean and like comparing it to something that we had never heard this metaphor for. Like, I don't care about that. I really don't care like that you found the perfect lineup of words for something. But he's describing like a situation too, like this weird trippy boyfriend that's like a placeholder in your life. I mean, the whole thing is creative.
Yeah, coming up with a situation.
A lot of times inexperienced writers think that it comes down to describing something with a unique set of words or adjectives. And it's really not that. It's not just language that we're talking about here.
That's right. Yeah. It's not just the language. I mean, beautiful language is part of it, but you have to see it first. And see is a metaphor, obviously, because it's not merely visual. But I think of the first story we ever did in this podcast, episode 1, The Midnight Zone, where the line that you pointed out was birds sent their questions into the air, or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Those aren't fancy words.
No.
That's just a different way of describing birdsong in the morning,
I remember that now. Yeah.
But it's such a new way to think about it and a really familiar thing. The other part of the workshop thing is like when I bring in something to the store to the workshop, I don't get that feedback either, right? I want the feedback of, am I seeing this in a new, interesting way? Am I describing it in those kinds of ways? And the same reason I have trouble giving that feedback to other writers, they probably have the same trouble giving that feedback to me. It's like, it's hard to like describe, to say, look again, did I capture that correctly or in an interesting way? Or do I only think I did? Like, did I fall on a cliche that I'm not really noticing? So it's a limitation of the workshop. It's also, I think, a limitation of our capacity to teach, because how do you teach someone to have that kind of eye?
That's what I was going to say. You know, like you said, that it's hard to tell someone to revisit something. And I think the reason it is hard to tell someone to revisit something because it hasn't come across as like unique enough or exciting enough or different enough is because there's not some alternative suggestion. All you can do by telling a writer that is point out the fact that they're not real good at this. They don't have a unique voice necessarily or a unique eye. That doesn't mean that they can't be like a great writer either. It's just with a writer like Coover, you can't hope to mimic that. You just hope to be able to like see the world the way he sees it briefly, you know? And maybe every once in a while there's something that you do see differently.
Well, yeah, that's like you can enjoy the way he sees it in his while you're reading his story, but then you shouldn't go then to your story and try to see it in the same way he did. You have to find your own way of seeing it, and that's the difficulty, is figuring out. I think it's a matter of recognizing that you might not be seeing it as clearly as you want to, and that you do need to work at that. Because we have so much media, we can see things in like a TV way. Like there's a lot of kind of visual shortcuts that are given to us in TV, YouTube videos, movies,
right?
That we then kind of, when we're thinking about something, we're going to unconsciously apply that visual shortcut, and then we're going to write it as if it's like, this is what I'm seeing for myself in my head as part of the story, and not recognize that we've translated what's like there through this lens to put on the page. And it's not ours. It's just something that's been given to us. I think the key to it is a lot of introspection and like figuring out, what am I actually seeing? What are my biases? What are my assumptions that I need to discard? You shouldn't write through your assumptions. You should like move them aside and get at what's right there. Maybe that's what Hemingway meant by write one true sentence and then write another one, is that the truth of it is the actual what you see without all those intervening lenses.
I feel like I'm just like going back to our earlier point saying this, but like I don't know if that's like one of our takeaways in this conversation being that like you can revisit something that you've described or whatever part of your story and kind of think to yourself like, is, you know, could I think about this a little harder, maybe come up with a better way of saying it? I guess what I want to say is like to caution people, the lesson here, the directive here is not to go add useless metaphor and description throughout your story to like make it flowery and to make people think like, wow, your brain works really special, this is really great. Like those are almost like red herrings, you know? We talk a lot about how inexperienced writers especially will start a story and say like, you know, she like swept a lock of her auburn hair behind her ear and like she was wearing a red shirt and the park bench was purple. Like when you point things like that out, the reader pays attention to them and it's usually for nothing, right? Those are like useless details. And I wouldn't say that a sentence like the one you pointed out, like where the birds sent their questions into the air, that's not useless. It's beautiful and wonderful. And it doesn't act as like this distracting phrase. It's really hard to point out the kind of language that I think we're talking about. And I do think it's like a natural knack that people have. I don't think you can necessarily like teach people how to write a phrase like the birds sending their questions up. That has to have occurred to you in real life, not on the page.
That's the key, is it's not just any old detail. It's the detail. The bird sending their questions is like an encompassing detail. It suggests a larger scene. It's like the defining detail, like the seed of something. So being able to see that, being able to find, to see those important details. I think this was a theme in some of our early episodes too. I remember when we talked about Alice Munro's story, we talked about details a lot, but figuring out which are the most important details that kind of suggest the scene. One of the things I was talking about with the lens thing is like what you talked about, like pushing the lock of hair behind your ear. Like that's something you saw on TV, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then something you maybe read in like 50 different books. So that's not your own. You didn't see that out in the real world. It's not like the way that it actually played out. That's not the truth of the matter, to go back to Hemingway. The truth of the matter is some other detail that you didn't notice at first impression, that you have to like study the scene and figure out what's that true detail that really sets it all up.
Yeah.
So in that way, it's not about the language.
Right.
It's about seeing the detail, and then expressing the detail is where the language comes in. And then that can be done in very simple ways. It doesn't have to be complex metaphors or like 50-cent words. And I guess now they're inflation, they're like $50 words.
I'm trying to think of a writer that I feel like has done this. Like going back to what I said, like you have to have like thought this way about something on your own, not just when you're trying to be clever and sitting down and writing it. I feel like I can read some stories sometimes and think to myself, whoever wrote this thought that they were being real clever in the moment when they sat down and wrote it this way. And they had to maybe think really hard to come up with it. I'm not saying that these are like that if you have to think hard or you have to try or or that like if writing is anything other than effortless, that it doesn't ring true. It's just I think you can sometimes read someone's work and know that they think that maybe they can sit in a empty room all day and come up with something brilliant. But there's a lot, I think, about being a writer is also observing the world and having your own kind of take and taste and recognition of things. We don't really talk about that, like the writing life, and I don't necessarily have tons of insight into that, but I know that there's writers who write stories about their lives. I mean, Stephen King for one, and they'll tell you things about like what their writing habits are and how they draw inspiration. And almost none of these books that I've read, at least, are writers that say, and I banged my head against the thesaurus for 6 hours and then I came up with the perfect phrase.
Yeah.
They're all really willing to say that they do things outside of writing that inform their writing. And I think like Coover has probably seen some frogs in real life, and I don't think he went and studied them. And he doesn't even have to be like a frog nerd, but like he did not sit down and think, I'm going to describe this frog prince thing like you have never seen it before. I think it probably part of it was brewing in him all along. And maybe he's always had a fondness for their little toes,
In John Gardner's On Becoming a Novelist, I remember he talks about the writer's eye. Like he talks about seeing the world, and like he gives an example from his life. He said he like came upon an accident, and I forget exactly. He said something like it gives you some remove from the immediacy of things, because you're like looking at it in this writer's way. And he said he remembered noticing these little details, like about how the wound looked and different things. But it's a way of experiencing things. It's a way of seeing life, of being in life, that then informs when you go back to that empty room and you're sitting in front of the screen. You've had that experience, you've seen it, so that you can now put it on a page.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe if one of the takeaways would be like that you can romanticize like your own life that way, like while you're out in the world not writing, you are a writer at work, you are studying, which I wouldn't really encourage. And it goes back to the whole like write what you know thing.
I remember reading Saul Stein in Stein on Writing, I think it was. He talked about, as a young writer, he and a couple other writers would go up, I forget where, like a mall or something, and they had like a place where they could sit and they could see the crowd, and they would sit up there and they would watch people and look for little details that kind of suggested the story of that person. I don't think they literally wrote them. I think they told each other like that person there, and they tell the story of that person based on the little details they could spot. I think of that so much. Like I feel like that should be like a writer's workshop field trip.
Yeah.
Right? They get the group together and go to an airport or something, and you sit on a bench and you just watch people, and then all right, what's that guy's story? Say, well, notice how this and notice this, that means this. That's who his personality based on those details. I think that's like the way that you practice, the way that you can practice and get better at this, having this vision we talked about.
Yeah. I would argue that we all have done this, but it's usually from a place of like judgment, right? So there's also like
gossip, the original storytelling.
No, for real. I mean, like unless you're like paying attention to people around you and like engaged with all of this and observant, I don't think you have to like people, but you have to be interested in them. You can't really hope to capture a lot of this stuff. I guess my takeaway has nothing to do with what we talked about, though.
This is one of those episodes where we go far afield of the story.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the frog anymore. We're talking about writing in this like lofty way.
Yeah. I mean, we touched on this, but I really like how this was a fairy tale concept that we're all extremely familiar with, and yet it was a very fresh take on it. And I don't think you should go out and do something as bizarre as this necessarily, but I'm sure that there are fairy tales that you've always been fond of, and you could probably revisit some aspect of some of it and use it. That was my like immediate thought, was if I was going to assign this in like a 5-minute workshop exercise, everyone can think of a fairy tale that they really like, or like a fable even. I like fables too.
Yeah, those like little stories. I think that's a great kind of like way to come up with stories. I remember there's always the revenge story. Like Inigo Montoya, you killed my father, prepare to die. Like he spent 20 years or whatever preparing for this revenge. And I thought about that over and over again. I finally wrote a story because I was like, how do I rewrite that story in a different way? And so I wrote a story about revenge where it turns out very differently. But that was all because of just taking that one little thing.
Yeah. And if they're so pervasive in society, and then like that one in particular for you is one that you've thought about repeatedly, I'm sure everyone has something like that. And you can either rewrite it or just like, I don't know, there's probably some aspect of whatever it is.
For everyone who gof annoyed with happily ever after as the ending of a story, like write that story. Why are you annoyed with happily ever after?
Yeah, that was my kind of like kindergarten level takeaway was, like what's on the surface of this and what can I do right now? So what's your takeaway, John?
My takeaway was what we were talking about, just that vision. His descriptions are so vivid. It speaks to just the writer's eye. And we over talked about that. So
we did. This was a good one. Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys.
If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.